So tell us, Don, how is this book doing?
I've no idea. I don't know. I haven't received any figures from anywhere. So I'm just got my fingers crossed. It's a hope and a prayer, really.
Well, it's a very nice book. Very reasonable as well.
It's a reasonable price and the cover is marvellous. I think the cover would sell it.
Don Milligan, The Embrace of Capital, Capitalism from the Inside. Yeah, so tell us about the image.
Well, the image is a young woman who's peering through a pair of spanners, and it rather amused me when I saw it because I thought, oh, it's Rosie the Riveter for today. She doesn't know what to do with the spanners, so she's looking through them. So I thought that was a marvellous kind of comment on deindustrialisation, and also that I was pleased that when I found the image, the publishers bought it for me, so they could use it on the cover.
Yeah, so it's a work of history. It's a work of memoir as well, I think.
It is, yes, it is. It's both. I mean, I inserted lots of personal experiences as illustrations, really, of the general argument that if you've lived an entire life in the political margins, selling papers that nobody actually wants.
So this is you're telling us about your sort of listeners. You're telling us about your background in various left-wing parties over the years.
Indeed, yeah, and it's unconscionable the length of time that it took to realise that one was on a hiding to nothing. That none of this was going to work.
Well, that's what it's about as well. It's because it's a book about the left. It's a book about the history of left-wing politics. It's called The Embrace of Capital. That's one of the things that interests me about it, because I think that everyone who calls himself on the left should read it, because you identify a particular problem. Well, you identify a lot of problems for the left, actually, in it. But one of them, I think the principal one, is that they misunderstand the structure of commercial society.
I think that's right. I think they misunderstand. And this misunderstanding, this fundamental misunderstanding began in the 1950s. That as industrial workers got richer, by the end of the 50s, I mean, I remember myself when oranges and other fruits became routine in the house. I mean, they used to be only for Christmas, but by the end of the 50s, they were every week. Luxuries like fruit and so on. But the left were very disturbed by the idea of the avalanche of white goods, of refrigerators and televisions entering working class homes, and that there was a sense in which this was undermining the traditional collectivity, or what Raymond Williams called common sharing. Right. And of course nobody wanted bloody common sharing. They wanted a washing machine.
They wanted their cool fridge and higher purchase.
That's right. And so these upper middle class intellectuals and academics were dismayed by the destruction of what they imagined the working class should be.
I'm interested in a lot of the book, but I'm interested in the more philosophical part of it as well. It's a book that's informed by Marx, I think.
Indeed, of course.
So let's start with the top. It's The Embrace of Capital. And I presume by embrace you mean the working class who are embracing capital and capitalism. But when you say the word capital,
I think we're embraced by capital.
What is that? Could you speak to that a little bit? Or
I think it means that capitalist society is a world unto itself. What you must understand is it's not simply a mode of production. It's a mode of life. Now, in a formal sense, most socialists, most people on the left would accept it's a mode of life as well as a mode of production, but the mode of life would always get short shrift, really. The tendency to simply see it as an economic system, despite everything that Gramsci had to say, despite everything that marvellous Marxist historians have to say, like Braudel or a whole raft of people, E.P. Thompson, etc. Despite being informed by any of this tradition, it never really informed the view that capitalism was simply an economic system that had to be overthrown.
So it's cultural. So capital is culture in addition to the economic side of things.
That's why I focus a lot on luxury consumption and the idea of advertising and so on, because you have to understand that capitalism Western capitalism arose on the basis of trade in luxury goods, in Chinese porcelain and spices from the Far East, right? So it was entirely based on luxury. The transactions were based on luxury. Then moving on to the trade in human beings in terms of chattel slavery and so on. So what's really clear about the development of the system is there was no separation between culture and the economy. It completely they inform each other to the most extraordinary degree. So those marvellous blue tiles from Delft or any of those things from Holland, so Holland becomes the first country that's based on trade, really. I mean, of course, earlier situations like Venice and so on were based on trade too, but Holland and England were the first countries that were completely engaged and dominated by trade, by commerce, what Adam Smith calls commercial society, which I've used interchangeably throughout the book with capitalism, because I think most readers will understand commercial society, describing the world they live in, much better than formal words like capitalism or whatever.
This is what the left missed then. That's one of the big things that left-wing politicians, left-wing thinkers, left-wing militant groups do not pick up on. They miss.
I think they do, and I think that the error lies in the fact of the elaboration of certain theories, which reality then has to be shoehorned into. So you attempt to shoehorn the working class into the theory. So that the fact that most struggles are not working class struggles, they're sections of the working class or sections of the lower middle class or admixtures of all this, is neither here nor there. The left will say objectively a movement is either reactionary or bourgeois or middle or working class, right? And so there's constantly the tendency to shoehorn reality into the theoretical structure, and that undermines one's understanding of it. That's why I think that Marx is so brilliant and so important. We should learn from Marx, because Marx spent his time trying to understand the society he lived in. right? He looked very closely at it. He tried to understand how it worked, and the left doesn't do that.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that always distinguishes your work, Don, is critique of the left from the left, or a critique of the left from a Marxist perspective. Is there things in Marx, do you think, which easily give themselves to that type of abstraction? So, I don't know, things like false consciousness, alienation, the critique of commodity fetishism, those core Marxist concepts. Is there something about them that allows them to be reified?
I think that one of the interesting things is, because Marx only published one book, right, the first volume of Capital. The rest of Marx's oeuvre is spatchcocked together by Engels and a whole lot of other people over the years. So Engels is, I mean, he was a good chap, and he did all kinds of and wrote all kinds of important things. But he's also a villain in the sense that a number of things in his oeuvre simplifies things and vulgarizes things that Marx might have said or done. So I'm not an expert on Marx's writing, but I would say that the thing that really impresses me about Marx is he does try to understand what's happening, and he's entirely wrong. For instance, him and Engels were wrong in the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Because they envisaged class relations becoming simpler. Two great classes would confront each other, and the working class would society would become more and more proletarianized. And in fact, the manifesto is entirely wrong about that, because as the system developed, as capitalism developed in the 19th century, the complexity of the class relations and the complexity of the working class, for instance, that becomes, after 1867, half the working class had the vote. Working class men had the vote. Another half didn't have the vote, quite apart from women, who none of them had the vote. But then there were masses and masses of labouring working men who lived an entirely different life from those who had the vote, who were more skilled and more able to pay the £10 per annum rent that gave them the vote.
When you talk about working class, and I think that's one of the common themes throughout the book, is that the left and leftists misidentify working class concerns, and they characterize or mischaracterize what being a working person is actually like.
Absolutely.
What's it about?
They have an imaginary working class.
So for your, and this is one of the things you talk about in the book, it's the working class is not something undifferentiated. It's not something like, it's not a homogeneous blob. It's full of a variety of different experiences.
Vastly different. And also the other thing is to understand its historical development, because of course the working class is a product of capital, not of its own consciousness. Marx would have told us, as capital changes, the working class changes. So we've got different working classes. The marvellous book by E.P. Thompson on the making of the English working class is a brilliant book about the emergence of the working class in its earliest phase of industrialisation. But it finishes in 1832. I mean, the working class is something quite different by 1850, because the whole structure of the society had altered, was shifting under the ground. And by the Second Great Reform Act of 1867, when a vast number of workers, working class men, got the vote and became citizens, you're not in the world of E.P. Thompson and the making of the English worker at all. And again, it changes by the mass trade unionism of labouring people, unskilled workers, at the end of the 19th century. You're not in the world of the 1840s or the 1850s again. It changes. And similarly, the changes in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s absolutely transformed the working class again. And no doubt artificial intelligence and robotics and so on are going to change the working class again.
I think Marx himself kind of recognised this, doesn't he? When the earlier Marx, it kind of had a very simplistic three-class structure. You got sort of your bourgeoisie, you got your proletariat, and you got the elites. And even he, after he talked about the spectre haunting Europe, of the spectre of capitalism, that's something that he himself revised.
Absolutely. I mean, the other thing about Marx is to understand, even in a document like the Manifesto of 1848, the brilliant observation of what we would now call globalization. Marx did understand the overall trajectory of the system. He really did understand it. I've often got students to look at the manifesto from the point of view of globalization and see what the old fellow had to say about it.
In a more biographical, in terms of the lived experience of your own background, you're from a working class background.
Yeah.
You talk about that. You talk about your mum who came from Ireland. You talk about your father. Your father was a labourer, is that right?
He was a labourer, and then he became a bench fitter. So he was a skilled man in a factory. One
of the moments that you started talking about in the book, the book sets off with your discussion of the royal wedding of the Lady Spencer, Lady Diana herself, and now King Charles.
That's right.
So we were recording this the day after the royal funeral, so the listeners know it's very present to our mind. But one of the things I thought was an interesting little vignette to begin the book is that you are a confirmed communist and a Republican. You're also a Democrat, I think, last I checked. But you also said you are enchanted by the spectacle. Now, before you came on, you did a full marathon yesterday. You watched the whole royal funeral, right?
Yeah.
And I think that speaks to the themes of the book. And it seems to speak of working class life and experience is very diverse and diffuse and changes. However, they tend to like the monarch, royal life and what it represents. I know you were into it because of embroidery, as you said.
But yes, I mean, the truth of the matter is the lessons of the left, what the left bangs on about, is very dismal and miserable. The left's all telling you how it's all going to go wrong, how everything is dreadful, and the poor are being shafted and all the rest. Now, the working class knows full well that the poor are being shafted. They don't need the left to tell them that. They don't need the left to tell them that capitalism is not going to give them a world of peace and prosperity. The royal spectacle, Lady Diana or whatever, partly I'm sure that it's not irrelevant that I'm a homosexual and I've spent time as a window dresser. So So 8 metres of English silk down the steps of St Paul's from Lady Di's wedding dress. It was spectacular, marvellous as far as I was concerned. And my comrades in the Revolutionary Communist Party looked at me with absolute horror when I was talking about this. And I think that there's an idea about what the political consequences or what it kind of politically represents in some sense. They like the whole business, the whole fun of the whole thing. It takes them out of ordinary life. They also express things like it's a moment of history, all that kind of thing. So it gives people a certain kind of significance. Now, Marxists and Marxism, many Marxists will go on and on about alienation and people being alienated, because people are indeed alienated, and somehow something like an institution like the monarchy has got some connection with their alienation, like advertising. Advertising is marvellous. When you're looking at some marvellous, beautiful bloke in the wonderful shirt, and there he is on the advertising hoarding or on the TV or what, you're not going to look as good as him in the shirt. But on the other hand, you'll give it a go. The spectacle of capitalist society is just marvellous.
So that's an aspirational thing then, isn't it? It allows you to transcend your existing material conditions.
Everybody from Raymond Williams to John Lennon was prepared to say that advertising is lies, and you think you're clever and classless and free.
You recite that, don't you? You say, John Lennon, what's the famous line? It keeps you doped with religion, sex
and TV.
That's it. But the working class,
still fucking peasants as far as I can see, says the song. So this is the same line as Raymond Williams and these more intellectual leftist critics who are constantly saying that the working class are bludgeoned by advertising and don't understand. Actually, the working class are well aware that life is better with a washing machine than without. They are perfectly love the idea of getting into debt to go to a Greek island for 10 days and take the kids and have a marvellous time. Somehow, the leftist intelligentsia doesn't. The leftist intelligentsia wants to tell you it's all nonsense.
That also speaks to why working class folk embrace capital, the way you put it. It's because capital has a levelling effect, which is, that Marx says that, doesn't he? And I think it's the Communist Manifesto. It's sort of the universal asset,
Yeah.
But that means it undermines hierarchy, if not guaranteeing opportunity, at least. Where capital can allow people to be aspirational
you can
so
be
on.
who you like, and we know that you can't actually be who you like, but there's the prospect of being who you can look gorgeous and glorious and all the rest of it. And you can see what a disaster this is, because inappropriate people take up the wrong fashions and they look like awful. But the fact of the matter is that people engage with the whole enterprise. You see young women tottering on stilts on Saturday night in Manchester in hardly any clothes and they think they look marvellous. Well, good luck to them. They think they look marvellous. They're not going to take the slightest bit of notice of the socialist worker or anything else telling them that it's all miserable, because they don't believe it.
Gotcha. Now, one of the other things that the left, I think, does not get about the working class, you claim, is the question of exploitation. In some sense, those lasses who wear very little clothes and are on very high-heel shoes, the idea would be that they are a victim of false consciousness or something like that. Or in sort of more everyday sense, you hear it quite a lot. You sort of heard a lot about the Brexit vote from leftists.
Oh, indeed, yeah.
There was the idea they voted against their interests.
Yeah.
So, and it's very... Same as John Lennon, it's a very snooty attitude, that.
Well, yeah, I mean, as I say, the well-heeled literary critic, Raymond Williams, and the millionaire musician, John Lennon, had fine ideas about all this. But of course they were separated in some way or another, whatever their origins were, from what's going on, what working people's experience. They want to own their house or flat, and if they can't own their house or flat, they want defensible rights for their tenancies and so on. So they believe in the rule of law.
We will talk about that, actually, because you spend a lot of time talking about that in the nature of contracts, and I think that was really interesting. The question of exploitation is, I want to talk a little bit about your biographical account here, is the unhappiness of the workers. That's the thought, right? Yeah. So you tell the story of working in an office in Stockport and being reprimanded unjustly because some of your students were claiming excessive expenses. And the subsequent job you talked about was with strict observant Muslims, and some of your colleagues basically
saying I shouldn't be there because I was homosexual.
Precisely, yeah. And that basically thought you should be sacked because of your sexuality. I think the thing that the left is missing, that you're claiming, is that the unhappiness stems from treatment, not so much from the inequality of the workplace, because kind of the idea is that we know anyone who's any job knows that the boss probably is going to have a better car than you or a nicer house.
Yeah, and also they also know the boss better not go broke, because if he goes broke, you'll be out of a job.
Right, yeah, you say that as well, isn't it? Because you want your enterprise to be successful. You want your enterprise to be profitable.
At least keep you in work.
Yeah, so that then is that. Well, I suppose that's what I'm wondering. One of the things we do is we don't accept iniquity, do we, workers? In the broad sense,
fairness is a key value in the society and among most working people. You know, they believe in fairness. They believe in people being treated fairly. That doesn't mean to say they don't the abolition of inequality, because they can accept levels of inequality at the same time as they're concerned for fairness. And, you know, in most jobs, I think I argue that in most jobs, I've never heard anyone complain about being exploited. They always complain about being badly treated by the boss or the supervisors or whatever, and disregarded. I think the most important thing is people feel disregarded in the workplace. And this causes immense bitterness and can dominate one's life. Feel disregarded. And
I suppose the idea is that for the left then is that exploitation comes at the hands of, I don't know, the boss class or something like that.
Well, it's also abstract because, of course, the truth of the matter is half the working class work for small business. They work in small units and they know the boss, right? They might be married to the boss's brother. You know, it's quite a complicated set of relationships. It's not some faceless capitalist class that they work for. They work for small employers. And even in the other half of the working class works for giant companies and so on. But even there, their experience of the giant company is the supervisor, the local manager, all that. So the personal relations are prime.
Well, I think it's an interesting one, because you're not saying that working class folk don't have a sense of fairness or a kind of that sort of vernacular.
Absolutely, and also
egalitarianism, perhaps.
And also they're perfectly prepared to have a go at the bosses in all sorts of situations. I mean, I describe a situation when I was a young labourer and I was horrified as I was ordered down to clear this pipe junction in this trench.
Yes, this is in the book, isn't it? Yeah,
right. And to clear it of mud and stuff. But it was full of water, this trench. And I expostulated. I said, I can't go down there. It's full of water. And the tradesmen, all the skilled men on the site, all gathered round and were hooting with laughter because they could see that I was a novice and hopeless labourer. But they sided with me against the site manager and said, no, you'll have to get the lad's right. You'll have to get a pump. And it's a kind of their delight in getting one over on by supporting me.
But there's a deeper point there, isn't there, though? It's more about sort of a spontaneous egalitarianism, where they go, absolutely, actually, we can improve our conditions here as well, because if young Don here gets a ladder or a pump, then we get one as well.
Well, yeah, I think Marx somewhere describes workers levering out bases for themselves in the course of the working day, which is of course true and continues to be true. So the class struggle in that sense, the struggle of workers, is perpetual and all the time. People are nibbling here and nibbling there and elbowing here and elbowing there, and in all sorts of complicated ways. So the left only recognises it if there's a strike. And they can have a picket. And of course that's become less and less an option as the structure of industry has changed, and it only really now exists on the railways and in the public sector. Basically, trade unionism is decayed everywhere else, really. And so what happens everywhere else? Well, everywhere the workers don't just give in all the time. They resist in all sorts of ways. And in fact, contracts of employment have improved over the years. All sorts of things have improved. Health and safety, all sorts of things have improved because of the actions of workers. Not trade unions necessarily, but just...
Well, it speaks to the question of egalitarianism, because that's one of the things that sort of left-wing thinking, socialist thinking prides itself on, is we do equality better than you. You know, well, and even that's a negative way of putting it. The strong belief in sort of the best society is a more equal and fairer society where there's, I don't know, a redistribution of income in some way, and which gives everybody opportunity. Now, one of the interesting things in the book that you talk about is how, and this is one of the things I think that you think a lot of leftists miss, is that the question of equality is a lot more based on the rule of law and contracts than necessarily, I don't say like a government mandated equality of rights or something like that. So there seems to be an illusion between civil rights in leftist thinking, so equality before the law, access to jobs, housing, education, public utilities, healthcare, water, so on. Maybe I'm getting this wrong, Don, but I think your idea is that the left confuse that with equality of outcome or equality of condition. So, the left is always about, we need to get society right, the social determinants of an individual. Yeah. People take drugs because they grew up in poverty or something like that.
And the reason that this confusion occurs is because the left never wants to give the bourgeoisie the credit for anything. They don't understand that actually the working class became citizens because of the struggle of the bourgeoisie within bourgeois society. Intellectuals,
right,
journalists, writers, novelists, all kinds of people were engaged in trying to ameliorate the awful conditions of the working poor. And in fact, this had an effect. This process of amelioration had an effect throughout the 19th century, well into the 20th century. Things have improved, and they haven't just improved because of push and shove. Certainly, the Second Great Reform Act of 1867 was brought about by a combination of pressures by the liberal intelligentsia, by all kinds of things, and the working class, and rioting. The Hyde Park riots of 1866 were terrifying for the ruling class. I mean, the whole of Mayfair was under siege. They had to bring out the soldiers and the police and so on. And the crowds wouldn't disperse for about 3 days, I think I'm right in saying. So, in fact, the fear of the working class, the fear of the masses, and the nightmare of the Irish in their cellars, who were, as I say in the book, a lot closer than the heart of darkness, right? Was actually, this was a danger to society. So the bourgeoisie, in a combination of of attempting to ameliorate conditions and all the rest of it, and sheer terror and fear of cholera and all kinds of things, created a situation in which the working class, over the period 1867 to 1928, got the vote, became citizens. And so that's a problem for the left. The problem for the left is recognising the success of the bourgeoisie in creating bourgeois democracy. They don't want to give it any credit. So they constantly are trying to say it's not real. Lenin described bourgeois parliaments as the cloak of bourgeois dictatorship. They're trying to suggest it's not real because, of course, the levers of most things in the society are controlled by property owners. And that's what capitalism is about. But they try to suggest that its social texture, the social rights that people have, are not real.
And at the core of that is the question of contracts.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and contracts are, you say, almost sacred and inviolable.
And people believe in them
very much, because people don't want their house to be burgled, or they don't want
a third of the population, or 2/3 of the population, I should say, own their own house. Through mortgages or whatever, but they own their own house, and they deal with lawyers, and they deal with, and they deal with the property registry, and so they got a great deal. They're not separate from the capitalist class in hating private property. They don't make a distinction between capital, which we know is a kind of property that can employ people, and consumption goods. So they want to protect their house and their furniture and their soft furnishings.
And they want the police to do that. People are policing by consent.
Well, if you read Peel's pamphlet on that, or his speech on that, policing by consent, you can see he was trying to deal with a situation in which there were militia and local militia who were utterly unreliable, half of them drunk most of the time. That's why the terrible massacre happened at Peterloo in Manchester in 1819. And so as the idea of police, formalised policing comes into existence, Peel talks about policing by consent and the idea of the citizenry. But of course, it's a partial thing. You can't have, until the mass of the population are citizens, you can't have real policing by consent. But he set the ball rolling. And that's, the left always talks about, has a tendency to always talk about bourgeois society and think about it as if it's fraudulent, as if it's not real.
And it's very real. Your house is very real. If you don't have it, you know it.
That's right, because of course you can point out all the terrible things that go wrong, miscarriages of justice, tower blocks burning down, all kind, and dozens, hundreds of people being killed. You can always point to awfulness, Aberfan, or you can always point to that, but that doesn't undermine the reality of the broad reality of the rights that we've got.
And the forms of life that underpin them. Yeah, that very diverse form of life. And let me just read something from your book, Don, because I think it's really nice. It's very well written, your book, Don. Available on Amazon and all good retailers, I'm sure. I'll put a link in the show notes, Don.
Yeah.
This is where you're talking about the imaginary working class, and what I wanted to read is about this quote tells you about the diversity of working class experience, I think. And that is again something that you say that we don't understand, or the left doesn't understand. So you say, this reminded me of Orwell, actually, when you're talking about his pigeon fanciers. If you remember that.
Right, yes.
When I read that word, Orwell, I was like, what's a pigeon fancier? So I had to look it up. Yeah. But okay, so you say, between these extremes, so that's the extremes of, so there are pockets of ignorance, fecklessness and disorganisation at one end of the working class, and high levels of skill, intellectual and cultural sophistication at the other end. Between these extremes, there is everything from people engaging in amateur theatre groups to respectable older folk in blazers bowling on well-kept greens. Gardening or home improvement are significant endeavours. There are avid viewers and listeners to public service broadcasting, BBC Radio 4, and those who never switch over from Radio 1 or their local music station. Millions tirelessly work for charities, for their church, for their synagogue or mosque, fundraising, staffing food banks, crewing lifeboats, singing in choirs, or spending precious hours rehearsing with the local brass band. There are those who enjoy the black tie functions, uproarious hymn nights, trips to concerts of classical music, Broadway and West End musicals, or spend their weekends playing guitar in rock bands, or excelling in gaming on computers, or esports as it's now known as. Yeah, I've even met a working class dressage champion whose day job was nursing the mentally ill. What a remarkable fellow he was. Yeah. But I suppose all of that, right, tells me something, that tons of that diversity of experience, Don, all of those different forms of life, all of those different activities, all of those different interests, they denote a pragmatism, I think. I'm not sure if you think that, but those working people are natural pragmatists. They're autodidacts in a sense. They learn how to be the dressage champion. Some of them have formal experience, no doubt, but that is something which characterises working people. And that's why they don't like the left, because the left are all full of pipe dreams and utopianism. Do you think that's fair?
Well, it's partly true. I wouldn't describe it as pragmatism. I would describe it as life and life interests, that people get interested in particular things. They may hate their bloody job, but actually joining the club that restores steam engines is the greatest thing since sliced bread, as far as they're concerned, or whatever it is. This springs in my mind from the ludicrous slogan that appeared some years ago about the 1% versus the 99%. This idea that society was divided between 1% of the super rich and 99% of people who weren't super rich. The tendency to forget that large numbers of working class people, if you hire a cleaner, she's quite likely to drive up to your house in a car. Right.
Blow me down.
That's right. And a lady in the corner shop, the co-op shop that I often go in, who's just come back from 2 weeks in Turkey. And I said, oh, that's marvellous. I said, where are you going next? She said, oh, in November, we're going to somewhere in the Caribbean. I said, really? You're going to the Caribbean? She said, oh, yes. She said, my boyfriend's got a really good job. And there she is in a nylon overall in the co-op doing this dismal job, right? And it is a dismal job, and she does it with great humour and engagement with the customers and all that. And that's the other thing, is that people might hate their jobs, but lots of people that you meet face to face with the public have extraordinary forbearance and good humour, and that's astonishing, really, when you think about how does that work. And it obviously works on the basis that they can't live on the basis that their job is miserable and hateful and everything. They're going to make the best of it. They're going to make the best of it, whatever it happens to be. And I don't think that's pragmatism. I think that's people living a life and trying to make out in whatever's been given to them.
Deal with the hand that they're dealt.
Whatever the hand is dealt, yeah, that's right. And people cope. And they also cope with all sorts of things. I mean, I remember talking to some youngsters who were talking about revolutions and all the rest of it. And I said, what would all the carers do? They said, what do you mean? I said, well, the million or so people that go after the aged and infirm and all the rest of it. If the supermarket was suddenly empty of food, how would they cope? I mean, you have to think about this.
With great difficulty, I would imagine.
Yes, you have to think about this, how society actually functions, when you're making proposals. Most people do not want a revolution, So going around saying we're revolutionaries, this is not a good thing as far as most people are concerned.
It's very disruptive, revolutions.
It will indeed. But the truth of the matter is that the revolutions that we conceive of in the past, I mean, we've all been gripped by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, I think, in the misunderstanding of that whole event.
Well, that was one of the things you mentioned. It's a philosophical concept, and it's the concept of voluntarism. And I think you traced that to the initial Bolshevik Revolution, where it was, everything became done by state bureaucracy and bureaucratization. Now, nobody likes bureaucracy, except bureaucrats, perhaps.
But the interesting thing about Lenin, for instance, and the Bolshevik Party in generally, they knew that the peasants believed in the private ownership of land. They knew that 90% of the population didn't agree with them, and yet they still seized power, right? Because they thought it'd be all right on the night. And of course, it wasn't all right on the night. Even the industrial workers that had largely participated in the overthrow of the existing centres of power of Tsarism, even the industrial workers ended up very, very quickly not agreeing with them, because a lot of the workers understood workers' control as a kind of syndicalism. They thought they would really actually control their factories. That wasn't the Bolshevik idea at all. It wasn't a syndicalist idea. And so they rose in rebellion against the Bolshevik regime. So the Bolsheviks had to engage in all sorts of struggles to suppress both the working class and particularly the peasantry, because the majority of people in Russia were peasants, and the peasants weren't an undifferentiated class by any means. There was the peasant with 5 cows and 3 hefty, healthy sons who were really able. And then there was a peasant who's a poor widow who's got one cow and no sons. Right? So people have fantastically different circumstances in the Russian village. And of course, naturally, the most successful farmers were at the head of the village committee, and the village, and when the revolution broke out in February, they seized the land. The Bolsheviks didn't seize the land, the peasants seized the land for themselves. Right? And the Russian Revolution was a real revolution. They seized lots of them burnt down the manor house or drove the rich family out and took over the land and divided it up through the village committees or councils or whatever they were. This idea that the Bolsheviks actually brought about this is not true. The mass of the peasantry took matters into their own hands. And then, of course, the Bolsheviks come along and take the land off the peasantry, effectively. And by the late 20s, by 1928, it's a disaster, the whole thing.
Yes, leading to famines and...
Yeah, absolutely, huge.
Yeah, so in terms of...
So voluntarism is what I'm saying. You get it on the right, of course. The American invasion of Iraq was a fine example of voluntarism gone mad. They thought if they invaded, got rid of the Ba'athist state, closed down the army, that there'd be capitalism and a democracy would simply emerge. And of course, this is nonsense. It wasn't going to happen. Similarly, the voluntarism of the left is the same. The Bolsheviks thought that because they had a thought that they could force it through and get what they wanted, they never got what they wanted. It was always a disaster. And every regime informed by Bolshevism has been a disaster. Varying degrees of bloodiness, but they've all been disasters. And so that whole question of voluntarism seems to me it doesn't take account of the things, the discrete things that you should attempt to preserve in society and the things that you should get rid of.
In terms of revolutions, it seems to be the case that the revolutions that are most important that the left doesn't pick up on are revolutions that are not the immediate overthrow of governments or seizing of power, of those things. Is technological revolutions.
Well, there's all that as well, but the political revolutions are important. The left never talks about the American Revolution. The American Revolution is a brilliant revolution. It's very successful. It's an extraordinary development in the world. Before the French Revolution, the French Revolution was a disaster. The left loves the French Revolution.
Good Burkean pint there, Don.
Yeah, the French Revolution was a complete disaster. You can see that because no form of stable bourgeois rule was instituted until the Prussians suppressed the Paris Commune in 1871, right? So it was almost a century of disorder and chaos. But the American Revolution was a success. Now, of course, immediately people will leap to the question of slavery, quite rightly, but it doesn't undermine the success of the American Revolution, or its nature. It informs its nature, but it was a successful revolution in an extraordinary extent. And the revolution in England in 1688, where William and Mary were brought in as a joint monarchy. This was a fantastically successful revolution because there were bills of, I forget what they were called, there were 2 bills of rights, which stipulated what the monarch could and could not do, and asserted the supremacy of Parliament, which we have to this day. The English Revolution, they don't like the left never likes the idea of the English Revolution because they think it was partial, but of course it was fantastically successful.
Well, yeah, they killed the king, killed the monarch. I know there was a restoration, obviously, but...
That's right. They killed the king in the middle of the 17th century, but and that laid the groundwork to the glorious revolution of 1688. Marx makes a very funny joke about how, following the establishment of the Bank of England and so on, surprisingly they didn't name the national debt the royal debt. He said every institution is always called royal except the national debt.
I like that's kind of catchy, the royal debt.
That's right, which is very funny. But the truth of the matter is that the establishment of parliamentary elections in the early part of the 18th century and so on and so forth is the groundwork of a society governed by law. So the institution of the rule of law, it emerges in the 18th century, and incidentally results because of the fear of hell. Really, there's a terrible fear that slavery will result in the British nation being cast into perdition. So there's a moral horror of slavery, and also the rebellions in the Caribbean, particularly in Haiti, brings an end to the institution of the British. They banned the slave trade, which was no mean thing to do in the early 19th century, because they had the British Navy, which was a vast and very effective force. And then they abolished slavery itself in the 1830s. But the left will go on tirelessly about how they paid compensation to the slave owners. This is the focus, not the fact they actually did it. And so there's always this negative view, whereas the positive, well, I would always say, even to an Irishman, there's the Cromwell of the English Revolution, and then there's the Cromwell of Drogheda and the massacres. There's the Cromwell of seizing Jamaica as a colony, and the Cromwell of abolishing the monarchy. There are all dualist elements in this. There's always one thing and another throughout English history, and so the left doesn't want to recognise that. They want to recognise one side, not the other.
Yes, it's. And, I have to put in the major caveat that Cromwell was a complete and utter bastard before I go ahead. But
he liked a good dance, Yeah,
he wasn't as miserable as everybody make him out to be.
That's right. He liked a good dance.
The point being, I suppose, Don, I might get excommunicated over this, Don. I have to tread carefully. I suppose, they don't like wins. The abolishment of slavery in England is a massive progressive win, that, even if it's not universal or it needs to be worked out. I mean, if you're an American, you'd probably say it's not really worked out until the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s.
Of the serfdom, yes.
Yeah. Or serfdom, yeah.
It's what I call what happened after the Civil War. The blacks were reduced to a kind of serfdom.
Absolutely, yeah. One of the interesting things in the book that I read was your depiction of containerization. So, about the shipping, the innovations in containerization. Well, it's not just intervention in containerization, but containerization, navigation, the move away from the traditional
dock labour,
precisely. That's what I'm driving on. Containerization bespeaks this very complex globalized world, and I'm not so much interested in that specific case study, but you can talk about it if you like. I'm interested in the adoption of technology. And traditionally, the left tends to be okay with technological innovation, I think. It's usually folk on the right who are, anti-modern or see technology, you did hear Tolkien's of the world, I suppose, who see technology as, in some sense, corrupting some kind of natural, organic society. And I think on the left, perhaps, there is some technological skepticism. You see it in probably some type of Luddism can emerge, where people are like, if a machine comes along, it's going to take away some jobs.
Well, yeah, it's very common, actually, I think. I think the left does have a problem with technology, because when containerization came along, the left spent several years fighting at containerization. In fact, it got to such absurd degrees that when a container would arrive at a port in the early days of the fight, they would insist on unpacking the container so it could be repacked with unionised dock labour. So this was a complete Luddism, complete struggle against this innovation. And when you think of containerisation, it's not that technical. It's just a box. But the advantage of it was that it could be standardized, could be loaded onto trains and onto truck bodies and so on, and it could be packed anywhere away from the trade unions and the dock side and so on. But it's manifestly, the traditional form of mixed cargoes with nets of things and crates and men having a steel hook that they held over their shoulders to grab goods and so on. This was obviously an inefficient system, so containerization swept the board. And despite ruthless battles and trade unions and strikes and across the world, the dock workers were defeated by containerization. And the same thing happened in printing with digitalization. So the left has historically had a number of problems with technology, and to this day the train driver must not open the doors. The guard must open the doors on the train, even though the technology has changed and so on. Or the ticket collectors should stay behind their glass panels as ticket collectors when nobody wants them there, because nobody buys tickets. Hardly anyone buys tickets anyway.
I can really sympathise with that, because what you're talking about there is the loss of jobs, and that's a loss of jobs is a loss of livelihood and money, and that feeds into people's kids going to schools and all the rest of all these things. But there's an inevitablism to that, isn't there?
There is, and as far as I'm concerned, for instance, if you think about the ticket sales, I would, if I was a trade unionist or whatever, I would struggle to insist that no jobs are lost, that people should be platform staff, they should have nice uniforms and help the customers, and there should be more presence of staff in the tube station, so that it's not threatening, particularly for young women, but it's not for anybody. So it's not threatening, it's safer and all the rest of it. And so the emphasis should be not on trying to hang on to booking hall staff, but to actually embrace the idea that this technology has done away with the need for booking hall staff. What we really need is loads of people there, safety, looking after, helping elderly people onto escalators or whatever it is. We want more staff around, and consequently on the train, of course there should be people on the train to look after you and all that. But at the moment, the guard runs up and down the train selling tickets and all the rest of it, and opening and shut the doors when he can. But constantly, the unions are in fights with these changes that are brought about by technology, but not in a creative way. They're constantly want to retain stuff.
There's also a subject you talk about in the book directly related to, I'm talking about the issue of gentrification. Yeah, and the term itself is...
It's hilarious.
Aristocratic, isn't it? The landed gentry are coming in and disrupting local communities because I suppose it's not a technological question. All those technological issues, because I suppose the question then is, there is going to be a kind of a sacrifice there, though, isn't there? If gentrification is the thing, what is gentrification? As I understand it,
gentrification is the creation of high rent neighbourhoods,
which can be disruptive to local communities often,
or can be. And the tendency on the left, and certainly on the anarchist left, but certainly on the left more broadly, is to blame the incoming tenants, i.e. the gentry, people who live there, instead of focusing on the question of land policy, property developers. What prices are going to be charged for anything? I mean, I live in a high-rent district in the middle of the city of Manchester, and clearly the council, in cahoots with property developers, has created the entire centre of Manchester as a high-rent district. Mostly the working class hasn't been driven out, because the working class never lived in the middle of Manchester anyway. But nevertheless, it creates a situation where only people who've got good jobs can live there, mostly younger people who can share rent and so on, but also people who've got good jobs can live in a particular neighbourhood, and they want all the things that go with having good jobs. They want good delicatessens, nice cafes, nice bars, and all that becomes a focal point for the entire city. Then people who can't afford to live there want to go there because it's a resort then.
But the heart of a question, because you and I think these are pretty crude criticisms of Marx. The idea is that you often hear this from people on the right who criticize leftist rhetoric or leftist political ideas. So I thought, whatever you think of, say, Mick Lynch, who's in Britain for another true son of Aaron.
They don't like his accent.
Yeah.
That's really all.
Yeah, well, I think he was on being interviewed recently with Richard Madeley, I think. So for listeners who are not from Britain, Richard Madeley he does a kind of a morning TV show, and the first thing he said was, "You're a Marxist, so you believe in the overthrow of the state, and you believe in nobody owns nothing." And I think he responded like, "Well, don't be talking twaddle," basically, you know. Yeah. But there is that view out there of Marxism, and it gets to the heart of this discussion we're having about the question of gentrification. I think because it's about property again. You know, that's the idea that in Marxism or Marx, that the idea is that there should be an abolition of property and everything is held in common. But that's not necessarily the case, is it?
It's not the case. Marx makes a joke about women being held in common as well. He was making a joke about that in the 19th century. But truth of the matter is, what we're talking about is the market. Can the market deliver good housing? Can the market deliver good education for working class children? Can the market provide excellent health insurance? The answer is no. That's why we have the NHS. The health insurance cannot be delivered at a profit by the market. That's why we have the NHS. Housing cannot be delivered effectively. A third of the population are never going to be able to buy their own house anyway, so they have to rent. At least a third. They have to rent. Can't allow it. Leave it to the market. If you leave it to the market, you have the planet of slums that we've got now. Vast numbers of people live in the most miserable conditions because of the market in housing in different countries, in different regions of the world, and so on. And also in Britain. So large numbers of people have rent flats where the electricity is dodgy, the wiring is disastrously dangerous, etc., etc. They've got damp coming in and all this business because the landlords don't have enough money. The private landlords don't have enough money to put it right, and so they shouldn't be in the business. They shouldn't be there. They should be driven out of the market. And the only people who can drive those buggers out of the market is the state or the local authority. My view is that the private rental accommodation is fine, but the rent should be determined by the local authority on area by area, and the landlord should be unable to do a no-fault eviction. So as long as the tenant is obeying the contract in every respect, then you should not be able to evict him. And if the only grounds in which the private landlord should be able to evict is if they have got a proven need to live in the property themselves, then they should be able to evict, but under no circumstances. So that would mean that nobody would be able to sell properties with vacant possession, etc., etc. Well, that would be okay because it applied to everybody. But it would result in large amounts of private capital leaving the area. And so the state would have to step in and provide that. So as long as there is a housing market, there's going to be villages on the coast, picturesque villages on the coast, completely occupied by second homers on the one hand, or slums in city centres and or in inner suburbs and whatever, unless the state intervenes. So that's what I think. It's the market is the problem.
And the state tends not to want to annoy rich property owners.
It's not necessarily given by capitalism. I mean, in New York, they still have rent control. So it's not a problem. I mean, you could have...
It can be done.
Yeah, it can be done within capitalism to have rent control and proper regulation of.
So what's the proper role of the state then for you? As someone who's been a leftist all your life, I know if you still call yourself that, you certainly still call yourself a communist, not a leftist. I think that'd be fair.
Yes.
Yeah, but what is the extent to which the state should intervene? Or is that something you've thought about? That's the John Stuart Mill idea philosophically, isn't it? That the state should be restricted from impinging on individual liberty.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot. And I haven't done the thinking, but there needs to be a lot of thinking among socialists and communists and people on the left generally. We need to think about ungoverned spaces. What, if we had a socialist state, what things wouldn't it do? Don't let's think about what it would do. Let's think about what it shouldn't do.
Yeah, so like arrest homosexuals and cart them into prison, for example.
Well, I wasn't even thinking at that level. I was thinking at the level of, who can have pets and who can't have pets. That's got nothing. That should be nothing to do with the state. It shouldn't be anything to do with the state. All sorts of things. People's what we call private life now, where it's got nothing to do with the state, etc., etc. So there's all sorts of ungoverned spaces in capitalist society which should be preserved as ungoverned spaces. And that's one of the people fear the socialists.
Because everything becomes public.
Yeah, because, of course, if you abolish capitalism and you institute a socialist setup, then what you've actually done is you've made every economic decision a political decision. That's effectively what you've done. So if you make every decision a political decision as to how you invest here or there or wherever, then it's a problem, because you then create the state control of job choice.
That also introduces bureaucracy, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you have to, somebody wants to be, a rock musician. Well, what's the basis? Under capitalism, you can live on the dole and be a rock musician, and you can make your way, and you can talk to a number of publicans and see if you can get a chance playing in their pub. Right? It's an ungoverned space as far as the state's concerned. I know there's licensing laws for music and God knows what, but that's not the issue. The issue is it's essentially an ungoverned space.
So what we're doing now is a bit of an ungoverned state. What the internet has done and technology is democratized broadcasting, effectively.
Yeah.
The state cannot intervene, you would say, in what we're doing now and say, come along, go, actually, no.
The internet could not have been developed in the Soviet Union. It could not have happened. It could not have happened in China or anywhere else. It can only be developed. It's a product of capitalist society and the ungoverned spaces, which is very interesting because the political right always says that the relationship between capitalism and private property is essential for freedom. That's, the road to serfdom, and all these people will all argue this. And of course they've got a point. I don't agree with them, but they've got a point. And the point, and this is the point: how do you create a situation where people are free? And unless socialists and communists are able to demonstrate that we can create a world where people are free, at least as free as they are in bourgeois society, as well as being in charge of the economy and so on, then we're on a hiding to nothing.
That's interesting to me because you introduced the idea of the right, and it's quite often in leftist discourse we forget the question of freedom, I think, or the value of freedom. I mean, I think it is in Marx, because Marx is a theory of freedom.
It's no true, but we read, most people on the left have been reading their Marx through the veil of Lenin, and Lenin was a tyrant, of course, ruling by decree. He was a dictator, along with the rest of his comrades. The truth of the matter is that in 1922, von Mises wrote a book called Socialism, in which he was arguing that socialism would be impossible because without the market you would never know what to produce, be able to determine prices and so on. And he was looking at 1922 was the year that the Soviet Union was created as well. But Hayek was looking at the revolutionary state in Russia as well. It's interesting that the left has never, von Mises is not on everybody's lips. It's not worth discussing, or Hayek or any of these people. But they raise a series of problems that we need to be able to answer if we're going to get anywhere. I don't think we can answer them.
You finished the book talking about what you call the future of communism, and I think in that you're modest. You're saying, you know, if you want to be called a communist, it's very difficult given the history of how it's been implemented, shall we say. But the last time you were on the podcast, and I'll put a link in the show notes as well, you spoke about your optimism. You know, your faith in people, your belief in people, your belief in democracy and the ability of working people to sort it out for themselves, right? Do you still feel that way?
Yeah.
Still, that's good.
Yes, certainly I do. Well, firstly, I think that the powers that be, the capitalist class or whatever, are not unadulterated bastards. Some of them are, some of them aren't. But they some of them are capable of rational judgment and rational policies and so on. And similarly, I think that the mass of working people are perfectly capable of resolving matters in their own hands. But it would not look like the traditional idea of the workers seizing control and so on. It would not look like Barcelona 1936. It's not going to look like that. But it is going to be created by working people insisting on certain things, as they've done over the years without much hoo-ha. But they've insisted on having better contracts of employment and so on. In working situations that are really wretched, the recruitment consultants call it churn. Right? So working people think that, fuck this job, we're off. Right? They leave it, and there's constant turnover of staff. So if you want to stabilise your workforce, you have to improve conditions,
and that's an inevitable.
Yeah,
it's necessary, shall we say?
It's necessary. It's part of what goes on.
So you're not at all anxious about, as a lot of leftists are, I think, about things like, I don't know, the war in the Ukraine, environmental issues, technological disruption.
Yeah, I'm anxious about all of those things, and it seems to me there's an awful lot that can go wrong. But overarching, in terms of the climate crisis, it seems to me that even if nothing else happens, there has to be disasters before the capitalist class will take it seriously, right? Because on the whole, they're buggers, right? So things have to start deteriorating quite rapidly before their eyes, before they realise it's necessary to do something about it. And I think we're reaching that point now, with Pakistan underwater, etc., etc. We're reaching that point where it becomes unarguable that they've got to do something about global warming and about they've got to increase the robustness of the economies and so on in relation to changes and so on.
And you think we'll sort it?
I think that they're perfectly capable of sorting it, yeah. And I think that the war in Ukraine could be disastrous. We could be defeated. On the other hand, I think that they've got every chance of winning. It's in the lap of the gods, and the Pentagon, whether they're able to get enough resources to beat the Russians. But it seems necessary to me that the Ukraine wins the war. The democracy wins the war against the dictatorship, right? That's necessary, and it's necessary for Taiwan. It's necessary for the standoff with China and so on.
Democratic forces need to prevail.
Absolutely, yeah, of course they do.
So you're not a man of peace, Don?
No, certainly not.
Shall we end there? No, I'm not. Okay, I'll stop there, Don. Thank you very much, Don.
You're welcome.